Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about Libya, which is going to lead us into some discussions about Turkey. But Libya continues to be a hot spot several years after it was taken apart by NATO forces helping the rebels. But nobody's been able to gain quite control of the country again, right, Jim?
Yeah, the problem always was that Gaddafi, for several decades, ruled the country by divide and conquer. In other words, he played one side after another. He was not a great conciliator. He was a great Machiavellian politician. And the big drawback with that was when he loses power. And yeah, NATO was essential with that because he threatened to basically start killing civilians en masse, which is part of his playbook. And that's the only thing that got NATO air power involved. But that really got him out of power quicker, which probably saved a lot of Libyan lives, except his. But it didn't solve the central problem is there is no unifying person or organization in Libya. Now, one did show up. They tried to form an elected government. They got one, I think it was in, what was that election, in 2015, 14? And that was
2014.
And that was the, they had a temporary committee put together to basically, arrange elections. They had these elections, which were sort of free, and they got this government, elected government, which is still in being, because they're the opposition now. Then the UN came in and said, all right, no, we're going to form another government, the Government of National Accord, which was ridiculous because it was anything but national accord. But they are the UN recognized, and they only control right now Tripoli and its eastern neighboring city, coastal city, Misrata. Now, the central problem in the civil war as it stands right now is the House of Representatives government, which hooked up with another unifier, a former Gaddafi officer who went into exile, is actually an American citizen now. But he and some of his sons came back, and he formed the Libyan National Army. And he was anti-Islamic terrorist, which made him very popular with most Syrians, especially in eastern Syria. And he proceeded to attack all the Islamic fundamentalist groups, which again is what most Libyans wanted. He, by the end of 2019, controlled about like 80% of the country. Most of the population, all of the oil. And he was closing in on the last stronghold of the GNA, which is Tripoli and Misrata. That's when the Turks got involved, and they did it for purely personal reasons. They talked to the GNA and said, "Look, if you'll sign a treaty with us, agreeing with our claims on water, water rights, between Libya and Turkey, which basically froze Greece out." We'll send in troops and we'll save your bacon, so to speak. And that's what's happening. Now, the problem is the EU will not recognize that agreement. The UN technically doesn't, but they're afraid to come out and say it. And they just signed yesterday or today, after weeks of hassling and whatnot. I think they were in Geneva or something for the final negotiations. All the key parties, and including General Hiftar, the head of the organizer of the LNA, to a national ceasefire and a period of political negotiation. Well, that may not work out, but right now they have a ceasefire. The Turks have apparently reduced their mercenary force, which is costing them a lot of money. They got paid double, so to speak, to these mercs to send them over to outside of Syria. And so the future is still murky, but at least the fighting has officially stopped. But what is a problem now is the problem Libya always had, and the GNA has much more so than the Libyan National Army, and that is the independent militias. They are, for example, insisting, the larger ones, there's about a dozen really big ones, want to have official representation at this political negotiations. Now that means no unity for Libya, because you still got these militias. Most of them are in Tripoli or Misrata, because they are the problem. Now Hiftar solved that problem. I mean, he didn't destroy these militias. He basically went in and gave them an offer they couldn't refuse. He gave the carrot and stick, and they realized that most of their constituents, because most of these militias are tribe based or geographically based, most of their constituents want peace, and you don't want these militias constantly fighting each other, because a lot of them, to sustain themselves, have gone gangster. And that was a big problem when Hiftar's LNA was closing in earlier in the year on Tripoli, before the Turkish mercenary force hit them in full force. They were still infighting going on, even though they were desperately trying to keep the LNA out of Tripoli, because if the LNA took Tripoli, it was all over for the militias. One way or another, they were going to submit. But they were still sniping at each other. And now they're still doing it. Even with the ceasefire, a lot of these militias feel, well, it doesn't really apply to me. I have to settle this beef I have with so-and-so militia. So the problems are still there. Now, Turkey insists that they will stay in order to secure their agreement with the GNA. So the Turks have a vested interest in sustaining the one of the two governments in Libya that is basically not sustainable. In other words, it has a minority of the population, a minority of the real estate, a minority of the legitimacy. I mean, most Libyans are fine to have, the LNA and the HOR take over and then hold elections. The propagandists, against the pro-UN or whatever, anti-Libya propagandists paint Hiftar as another Gaddafi. No such thing. He's 70-something years old. He's had health problems. He's got a couple of his sons, most of whom I think are American-born. He's got 5, I think, and a couple of daughters. But they're just, junior-level, flunkies for dad. And none of them has shown any interest or, ability to become another Gaddafi. So if there's going to be another Gaddafi, it's not going to be from the Hiftar family. It's liable to be any one of these militias, but I doubt it. Gaddafi stepped in at a time when Libya was united. They had the monarchy. He was a junior officer. He saw an opportunity. He took it. But that situation no longer applies. The country is split into tribal and geographic fragments. And the only thing that's going to bring it together is a democratic election, so they can fight it out in the legislature instead of in the streets. The Islamic terrorists are much diminished. One thing the GNA mustered its militias for was to destroy or at least eliminate the major ISIL threat, Islamic State threat. There are still some of them there, but they have no real clout. And if they basically show themselves too much, Hiftar will go after them, and that's it. They know they can't deal with Hiftar, and they've already been beaten by the GNA, which again had assistance from American air support in that final battle in Sirte, the city, another coastal city. So the situation there is pretty much who knows. Eventually, they're going to have to reach some sort of agreement, because that's what most Libyans want. Libyans miss the one thing that Gaddafi did well, and that was a sort of a welfare state. He spread the money around, which is what oil-rich Arab countries do if the current rulers want to stay in power. In fact, they at one point before Gaddafi fell, they employed about 1 million Egyptians. Basically, did all the work, or a lot of the work, and some Palestinians, and basically Arab economic mercenaries, so to speak, from all over the Arab world. Most of them are gone. And it'll never be the same but because there's enormous corruption in Libya. Libya is one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. So they have their own internal demons to play with, but what they want to get free of now is this constant war. It's not a very, how should I put it, a violent war. There aren't that many casualties. I mean, on the average month, there might be maybe 100 dead, a couple hundred wounded, and then about half of them are civilians. It's one of these things where a firefight consists of a lot of guys who can't aim shooting in the air. Gaddafi's advantage was he had guys who knew how to shoot straight and shoot the kill. And that's all it took. But see, that's what the Turks brought in. They brought in these Syrian mercenaries, who are basically veteran. They belong to they originally started as people who were in the Free Syrian Army, a secular militia, which the United States and Turkey backed early on in the war, but they lost out to the majority of militias, which were Islamic in Syria. That's literally where ISIL was born, by a collection of former Iraqi Al Qaeda factions, who said, let's be the king of it all. Let's be worse than everybody else. Which didn't work out in the end. But there are still Al Qaeda, affiliates in Libya, and a few smaller ones, but they're no longer as powerful as they used to be, and they basically have to keep their heads down. They, of course, these residual Islamic terrorist groups would love to have the UN sponsored government because they know it's weaker. Hiftar is the real deal. He doesn't play around. That's why I say he's popular with most Libyans. I mean, they can do the math. He's an old guy. He's an effective leader, but he's not Rommel. He's not running around and making post-war plans to be a military dictator. He just hasn't got it. I mean, everything he said and everything he does indicates otherwise, but that doesn't stop the propaganda. If the narrative is that he's the bad guy, Gaddafi, that's still going to have currency. But the reality is otherwise. Now, the other thing that brought up for this discussion was the Turkish mercenaries. Now, this is something very clever with the Turks. They have been fighting in northern Syria for 4 or 5 years now, and Erdogan, Recep Erdogan, or Sultan Erdogan, Sultan Recep as we call him, and so many Turks do, he realized early on that it was popular to send some troops into the border area to basically make sure that Islamic State or any other Islamic terrorist groups didn't make attacks in Turkey. And he did that. He basically proposed setting up a 30-kilometer deep neutral zone on the Syrian side of the border that would be patrolled, or basically policed by the FSA, initially on the Turkish payroll, but eventually self-sustaining. And all they had to do was keep the terrorists out of Turkey and basically unwanted refugees. There are currently 3.6 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Turkey wants to send them home. Their plan was to send them to this neutral zone. The only way you could get out of that was to get a residency permit in Turkey. Now, some very skilled or educated Syrian refugees can get that permit. In other words, the Turks are very choosy. If you're very useful for Turkey, they'll give you the residency permit, maybe eventual citizenship. The other way to get it was to serve with the mercenaries. Now, the Turks, again, they're clever. They hire them, they send them through basic training under Turkish NCOs, who also evaluate their combat abilities. A lot of them are veterans of years of fighting for the FSA or one militia or the other, and ended up just fleeing with their families to Turkey. These guys do not want to. They want to have residency in Turkey. They might go work for the Turks in Syria, but they're not going to live there. And every time the Turks hire another one, they're basically committing themselves, if these guys serve enough 3 to 6 month contracts, that bingo, they and their families, which may be another dozen people, get residency permits, get to leave the refugee camps, can send the kids to school, can take jobs, etc. All the things a residency permit allows you. They get a Turkish green card. But it's dangerous work, even though the Turks, They provide medical care, long-term care for your badly wounded, and death benefits. They get the family gets a lump sum, and I believe, I don't know if they're still doing it, they give them a residency permit. But it only affects the minority of these refugees because, like I say, they have about 15,000. They've probably recruited and discharged maybe 30,000 at tops of these mercenaries. So you got 30,000 families or less among these half a million families at least in Syria. So it's a drop in the bucket. And they still have to worry about getting them back in there. Now, why they're doing all these other foreign adventures? The Turks have troops in Somalia. In the news, you hear about it in Azerbaijan, their fellow Turks, where they apparently have at least a few hundred of these mercenaries, and Libya and Syria. And they also have, some, how should I put it, some friendly Kurds in northern Iraq, which I wouldn't exactly call mercenaries, but yeah, they're on the payroll and they basically cooperate with the Turks. But yeah, they're spread pretty thin. And they joke in Turkey about Erdogan trying to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, which is not popular with the Turks. But they joke basically that it's a delusion. The only Turk who wants another Ottoman Empire is their current unpopular president.
Well, Jim's brought you up to snuff on Libya, the two factions, the LNA and GNA. I'm going to add some historical perspective to this and historical perspective of Turkey and Libya, but I want to pick up on Jim's last point about what Erdogan, Sultan Recep. That is the way because the Sultan always gets his first name, Sultan, but yeah, and then the last name of the Sultan, no, you call him, by his first name, but Sultan Recep is what the Turks mockingly refer to him at, or sometimes I think bitterly. Look, what he rode into power in 2002 was disgust with the corruption of the Republican People's Party, the Kemalist Party, the party that Kemal Ataturk established. The whole party wasn't corrupt, but certainly, the quote unquote deep state corruption. And Erdogan promised that he was going to, because he was a moral Muslim, he was going to. No, I'm mocking him now, but this is the way he came on. We're going to have values on this. Well, now he's starting by 2010. He was just as crooked as he could be, and the people around him, investigations going on. So he lost that because he really came into power in 2003. It was 2002 elections that his party, the Justice and Development Party, won, which is a quote unquote moderate Islamist party, and it's arguably, initially, there really was an example of a quote unquote Muslim party that was Muslim in its orientation, but pro democracy. And of course, what Erdogan started doing again about 2010, 2011 was solidifying power in a powerful presidency, which is where he is now. But it wasn't just this, I'm cleaning things up. He, on top of it, and yeah, it was legitimate. He was going to liberalize the economy in a classic British liberal sense of a liberal economy. And the Turkish economy boomed. It was, even his critics said, it's really legal for honest people to make money now. Now, does that sound bitter, Dan, or ironic? You got it. But that's it's even us honest people can make some money. The economy started sputtering. Jim, I'm thinking 2014 again myself. 2014, 2015. Yeah. Turkey also lost a lot of money in Libya in 2011 because the Turks had a lot of major construction projects And I'm talking, tens of millions, $100 million, construction projects by Turkish companies down there, both infrastructure in Tripoli, but oil infrastructure. There may be Egyptian workers, and plenty of them over in Cyrenaica, that's eastern Libya. But the Turks had contracts in both western Turkey, Tripolitania, and in eastern Libya, Cyrenaica. Why am I using the old Roman names? Well, because they've actually still got some historical significance. Think of GNA territory as Tripolitania and LNA primary territory, the east, Tobruk, as Cyrenaica, and you're not too far off. The Cyrenaica comes from the Greek city Cyrene or Kyrene, where Simon of Cyrene carried Christ's cross, was supposedly biblically from. Turks had investments that hurt them. It was also one of their interests in why they were a little bit flaky on Gaddafi's removal, even though they really had no political truck with him, and ultimately you saw Turkey involved in that NATO coalition to topple Gaddafi. But here's Erdogan. He's interested in Libya. We know what's going on in Syria, and I could comment, Jim. Yeah, it's about 2.6 million Syrians in Turkey now. For a while it was a little over 3 million, and some of them went on into Europe, moved into Central and Western Europe. A few of them have filtered back into that, and we're not supposed to call it a buffer zone, but it really is something of a buffer zone when you see where the Turkish military and the mercenaries forces, we'll call them pro-Turkish forces, are distributed along that the Syrian side of that southern border. That 2.6 million Syrians still in Turkey is a long-term problem. Some of them, there are plenty of wealthy Syrians fled to Turkey early on, and a lot of them moved into very nice apartments in Antakya, which is Antioch, that little cut of Turkey that drops into northern Syria. It's almost like Antakya now is a part of Turkey that's an Arab stan. But okay, it's not Antakya that's the issue. It's the camps on the Turkish side of the border with all of these refugees, and how Turkey can integrate some, but it can't integrate. It doesn't want to integrate all of them. It wants to return them to Syria, and that doesn't want to return them. I'm saying this is to Turkey's credit. Erdogan is not going to make this mistake either. I say, crossing my fingers, of sending Syrians back to their deaths. So there's going to be have to be some cantonization, I suppose, in northern Syria. It's something I think that Turkey, whether Erdogan's in charge or not, would support. But Erdogan, though, has some of these situations that he's gotten involved in. He's also got a little finger in Sudan, too, with that Turkish port, the Suwalki. It's Suwak, and it's right there near Port Sudan. That a lot of Arabs and Sudanese and East Africans are concerned about. He's got an economy sputtering. He's increasingly unpopular at home, and as you've pointed out many times, and everybody looking at what happens in a country falling apart with a strong man, is that foreign adventures are a attraction, because they're one way to look tough and a distraction. That's the other thing is why is he into it with the Greeks? Oh, well, the Greeks and Turks, that old fight. The thing is the Greeks have strong cases for the offshore gas rights. The Turks do as well. There's room in there for negotiation, but what he decides to do is send, like the Chinese do, big oil drilling test rigs and Turkish Navy ships into these areas to really, and then draw maps that divide up the Mediterranean basin in the way he wants to see it divided, not based on international law and primarily UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Egypt and Greece have reached some settlements. Cyprus is involved in it. Of course, the Israelis kicked this off when they discovered that big Leviathan gas field in their waters of the Mediterranean. And there's really kind of a consortium that's developed. You see with Israel and Egypt, Cyprus and Greece, but Libya comes into this because, as Jim pointed out, Libya the GNA bent over backwards to Erdogan to carve up the Mediterranean undersea gas fields in Turkey's favor, and that's whether that's going to stand up in court. It's unlikely. The risk that Erdogan runs is already getting into a sea battle with the Greeks backed up by the French, and that's an intra-NATO fight. I just don't see the Turks doing that. I don't see the French and the Greeks doing it, but it's the kind of bluff that's a dangerous game to play, especially when those natural resources can be profitably shared by everybody, and everybody would make peace and everybody make money. Now, last thing to get back, I'm going to go back to 1911 and 1912. Why? Because in 1910, what is now Libya was really three provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Really two provinces, and there was a part around Benghazi that was carved up in a slightly different political entity. Then there was also what I'll call the Outback, which was under a separate administrative area, but it was primarily Berbers. You could see that historical imprint even in 2011, because the Berbers were the ones out in the desert waging war on Gaddafi's forces. I'm going to leave the Berbers out of this for the moment. But in 1911, Italy invaded Libya because the driving force in this and new Italian, and this is before Mussolini. This was a Italian crown. They wanted to become a European imperial power, and Libya had been part of the old Roman Empire. That was part of the mythology being sold by Rome, and the Italian Navy, which was really of 1910, far superior to what the Ottoman Empire had, delivered Italian troops, and in the first month of September 1911, the Italian forces took over all of the major ports along the Libyan Mediterranean littoral, from Tripoli all the way across to Tobruk. And Tobruk is where the contemporary House of Representatives, which is the political authority for the Libyan National Army, is headquartered. And then it all froze because the Turks got enough of their, what I'll call their special forces, and some mercenary forces, and Arab mercenary forces, and Berber forces to resist the Italians as they tried to push into the interior and win a decisive victory. No, I don't think history is repeating itself, but there's some really interesting echoes in what we see now, and that no one can. You see the city control. You also see the east versus west elements, and you see the outback still now, with the exception of the oil-producing sectors in southeastern Libya, relatively untouched by the fighting and by the chaos. I say relatively untouched. There's Jim, maybe you come up with a town. It was a pro-Gaddafi town now that has Islamic State operatives in it.
That was Sirte. Sirte was
Sirte's on the coast. This one's back in the sand.
Oh yeah. I forget the name of it. Yeah.
All right. The thing is, I just
a whole lot for several Islamic groups.
It's not a big deal, but it's there. And part of the reason it's that they're somewhat dispersed is, and Jim got into this, Dan, is that the U.S. is only our quote unquote. We want it settled. I have a sneaking suspicion that we would be glad to see Haftar win because the Egyptians want him to win, and because the Egyptians tend to be pro whoever's in Cyrenaica, the eastern Libya, since that's their border. They want that peaceable, but we're not really taking sides on it. But our sides is if the Islamic State shows up, you can get hello U.S. Air Force or U.S. Navy because we'll help take that out, and we'll try to send surveillance assets to pin down Islamic State elements. As Jim said, though, they're largely dispersed and beaten there in Libya. Now, the reason I told the little historical bit is that there are some people in Turkey, some people who see this as a neo-Ottoman play by Erdogan, because it was part of the old Ottoman Empire, it's not the driving reason for Turkish involvement now. But it does have echoes, and it has domestic echoes within Turkey. It's not one that there are necessarily a lot of Turks that support it, but they're aware of it. And it's what I would say about the Turco-Italian War of 1911-1912. It was the first air war because the Italians employed monoplanes and dirigibles to drop bombs. And it was also that because when the Turks were tied up down there was what the advantage when the Balkan League kicked off the first Balkan War, because the Turks were tied up. So you might blame that war for the first and second Balkan Wars, which really kicked off World War I. A little history there. I'll leave it at that.
So, Jim, what other places is Erdogan involved with outside of Libya?
Well, he's got some Turks, like I say, in Somalia, in northern Iraq, where he's been fighting. Sometimes he sends in, I think there are ground troops there now. He has actually a couple of small special forces bases, special operations bases, but it's mainly air power. But the majority of his mercenaries are basically in Syria, with a large contingent in Libya, and a small number, under 1,000 apparently, in Azerbaijan, helping to fight the Armenians, who have, ever since 1991, managed to hang on to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is basically a area inside of Azerbaijan. Well, it's close to but not adjacent to the Armenian border. And Nagorno-Karabakh has a majority Armenian population. Now, during the Soviet Union days, it didn't make any difference. The Armenians were mainly in Armenia, and there were a bunch of them in Nagorno-Karabakh. But once the Soviet Union fell, Azerbaijan and Armenia became independent, and there was a dispute over, well, who shall rule over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Armenians took it by force, and they've held on to it ever since. Even though they have a smaller population, they don't have oil, they have a lower GDP, but they're better fighters, and that irritates the heck out of the Azerbaijanis, because hey, they're Turks and these Armenians, who the hell are they? And that's been very frustrating to Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan has gone so far as to become a major export customer for Israeli military equipment, including some weapons. So at the moment, Israel supports Azerbaijan, and Russia supports Armenia, but doesn't want to support it too much, even though they have a treaty with Armenia, a mutual defense military treaty. There are Russian troops inside of Armenia. So anyway, the Azerbaijanis just want to win one. So far, they haven't made much progress on the ground. They fired a lot of artillery and rockets and whatnot into Nagorno-Karabakh, which, of course, since 1991 has become almost entirely Armenian. They drove all the Turks out, and so Russia is one of his allies. If he can basically help Azerbaijan get Nagorno-Karabakh back, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And Erdogan would have to send a lot more mercenaries than he's got there now, or probably than he can afford to send, to win a decisive victory. So all the Turkish support for Azerbaijan is doing is getting more people killed. So far, most of them appear to be civilians.
Dan, one thing is you can't ignore the way Erdogan's government has been using the Turkish Navy in the Mediterranean. It's not just a show the flag, show the flag operations, but as he says, to establish Turkish interests in the Mediterranean. But there have been real confrontations between the Turks on one side and the French and the Greeks on the other. They've also, Turkish Navy operating off the Libyan coast. I don't think that's as much an issue, except when it comes into confrontation with other NATO navies, and they have been confrontations. And from the point of view of Erdogan's government, he touts them as being a tough guy instead of looking at the long-term interests that Turkey has. And Turkey's got legitimate claims to real portions of the potential gas fields and actual strongly suspected gas fields. But what's the value of it if you're fighting with potential customers as well? So
something else to point out about, and Austin can talk in more historical detail about this. What the Turks are trying to do is turn the eastern Mediterranean into a South China Sea, because technically they don't control the economic zones, as it were, of all the areas that they supposedly now claim because of the treaty with Libya. Because one of the big disputes when the Ottoman Empire fell apart was which islands belong to Turkey. Now, Greece got most of them, basically because they were on the winning side. But the Turks never really recognized that. I mean, they never agreed to it. They had to put up with it because they were basically, outnumbered. They fought another war after World War II to get to establish, their Turkish Republic. And Austin wrote a book about Ataturk, the guy who was in charge of that. And even at the end of that other peace treaty, the final peace treaty, they basically ceded, as it were, momentarily, these islands. One of them's like a rock, literally. I mean, that's why it's like the South China Sea. But an economic zone, which is like 360 kilometers from any land, as it were, is so large. It covers a lot of these lucrative, potential gas fields and other resources.
What are the name of these islands again, Jim?
Well, no, there's a whole bunch of them.
Well,
the Aegean Island.
there's one, and I'm going to mispronounce.
Yeah, I
the name.
can't remember the name either. It's
Yes.
obscure as heck.
Stellarizo, or it's close to
Yeah,
it.
something like that. But
It's in the
that's-
Med,
that's the
right
one that
off
really
of the
burns.
right. It's in the Med, right off of the south western part of the Turkish coast. It's not really in the Aegean, and it really is tiny. The thing is, there's room for negotiation and it's kind of out there by itself. It's not like part of the Aegean Greek island islands. And if you follow literally the unclosed law on it, yes, it's got this kind of huge cone coming south of it into some of these potential gas fields. But there's all kinds of room for negotiation on something like that. And this is where the Turks have a legitimate point. Excuse me, it's really on our continental shelf coming off there. And the thing is, though, is like sending your navy around and everybody running their ships into each other is not the way it's going to get solved. You end up looking, just like Jim said, like China being a bully in the South China Sea. They're really, in fact, the Israelis have been very, and I'll call it Greek Cyprus, but the Cypriot government have been very savvy in the way that they've dealt with one another. On the resource development and resource sharing in these gas fields. Understand that there's also likely natural gas off of the Lebanese coast, and there is a field that is right off of Gaza. And the Israelis, to their credit, are prepared, and maybe they're doing it now. I don't have the insight into what's being done with it, but prepared for the Palestinians living in Gaza to get royalties off of that those developed fields, because that would be the letter of the law. If that can be done by the Israelis and Palestinians, the Greeks and Cyprus and the Turks can settle that. And I'm saying, Austin, how do you know they can settle it? Because there's so much to gain by settling it. That's why. And Erdogan's reaction, and part of it has to do with his own domestic situation on this, is he's going to be a tough guy. I would separate that somewhat from some of the other issues. I mean, they've got a serious, bad pun, I didn't mean it, but issue with Syria's fragmentation. But he's also got this kind of pan-Turkic policy, too, where he's supporting Turkoman in Iraq and Syria, and also Turkic peoples all the way going to Western China and the Uyghurs, who happen to be Turks as well. So that puts Erdogan in conflict with Xi Jinping in Western China. Pan-Turkism, which reminds me of the old Russian Romanov Pan-Slavism in its own way. But anyway, that's another reason they refer to him as Sultan Recep. He's got all these irons in the fire to make himself all of them, Dan, do something as for his own ego, global leader or whatever it is. And I think at some point it comes down that this sounds novelistic, but and it's a psychological read, which I usually would avoid. But I think he's terribly jealous of Kemal Ataturk. And he wants to be the man who puts a 21st century imprint on Turkey. He's doing anything but bringing the kind of stability that Kemal brought. So, well, that's an observation about it.
We'll keep an eye on the Sultan and see what he continues to get up to. Just to tease our next episode of our Wargaming history, we'll be talking about Jim's political games and the monster game. And interested to get into the monster game. That should be an interesting discussion. So we'll see you both next time.
Bye, Dan.
Bye.
Hey, take care. Bye-bye.